called Badger to Death, which Chris Packham has kindly written the foreword for, which is really my story about how I got involved in the Badger Cull and the politics and the people behind it over the last 4 or so years. In writing that book, which has been very much down to a few people like Chris Packham and Patrick Barker that I've been working with over the last few years, he said, listen, every time you speak about this, Dominic, you tell a story and it's fascinating, we need to get this into a book. So we've put it into a book. But what I've done with it is try to tell a story about people, because it's very easy to look at a policy like this as a farm environment policy and just look at it from a politics point of view. But I think the most fascinating thing about the Badger debate is how we've seen a whole generation of people rise up and say, actually, I want to do something to stop this. And we've seen people in their streets, we've seen people in the fields, we've had a huge impact on the debate in the media and even in the legal process in the courts as well. Why is that the case? Why has there been a reaction to this? I think it's really because it's about the future of our countryside, it's about the future of our farming industry, and it's about making a stand for an animal that many people often don't even see. The fascinating thing about this debate is that when you go up and down the country, as I do, and talk at protests, and you have people coming out with their costumes and their placards, a lot of those people have never seen a badger alive at all. But what they do want to do is say, actually, the thought of killing it for no scientific reason, for what is clearly a political reason that the government and the farming industry push forward with, is fundamentally wrong. And to me, that's not just about badgers. Badgers have become a lightning rod issue for the future of our countryside, about how politicians make decisions about how we protect wildlife and the natural environment. Also in the book I talk about my own experience of working in government as an industry lobbyist before I became a wildlife conservationist. And I do have some sympathy with politicians, because I've worked with many of them over the years. When you sit in an office as a minister, it's a difficult job, because people come at you from all angles. They come at you from wildlife NGOs, they come at you from farming and industry interests, they come at you from the science policy side, both internally within your department and outside. And you've somehow got to find your way through all of this and make a decision at the end. And to be fair, the DEFRA secretary job is probably one of the most difficult, as you know, Kerry, shadowing it in government. It's controversial. There's not many decisions you take as DEFRA secretary that are not going to upset someone. Be it about fisheries, be it about agriculture policy, pesticides, GM foods, the list is endless. And badgers, of course, is one of them. But what fascinated me about the Badger Cull debate is if you go back 30 years, and one of the people I've been talking to when I started writing the book was Richard Mayer, who wrote a book back in 1985 called Fate of the Badger. And I've used that as quite a lot of source information historically for my book. But what made me think is that little has changed. If you go back to 1985, the debate was the same. You had the farming industry pushing on one side, we had questionable scientific evidence being put forward. We had the veterinary industry not really getting off the fence when they probably should have done on animal welfare issues. And we had animals being killed in large numbers, gassing to begin with, followed by shooting and trapping, which really did not deliver any significant benefit in reducing bovine TB. But we're here all these years later and repeating the same mistakes again. No one should underestimate the problem that bovine TB is for farmers, because we know it's a big, difficult social economic problem for them. It's a disease that when it gets into their herd means that their animals need to be slaughtered, it means they can't trade openly, they're restricted in moving animals in and out. I also know, and as Kerry knows, that this is a difficult business for many farmers. They're not making a lot of money. They're forcing the price of milk down, many of the retailers. Government policy has not helped. Often they're producing milk at a price which they're not even getting paid for by the major retailers to cover it. Part of that leads for them to trade cattle to supplement income, or it leads them to have to put more cattle into a system to make it intensive, where disease problems can become worse. And a lot of farmers contact me and say, absolutely, Dominic, I actually recognise a lot of what you're saying and your colleagues in the Badger Trust. I might not agree with you on everything, but there is something wrong here, because I'm a farmer and I'm worried about the future of my herd, and I don't think the NFU is listening to me, for example, about testing processes where they can be improved. I'm worried that there's been delays in getting a vaccine for cattle when we could have really moved this forward years ago. And I think there's a lot of politics in this, but at the end of the day, me as a farmer, I'm not really getting a solution to the problem. So you're upset about badgers being killed, but I don't feel my problem's being addressed either. So what you're really trying to do is to find a middle way. And in the book, I talk about what I think that middle way can be. I think that actually there is a solution to this problem. I think largely the Welsh Government approach, which Labour has been pursuing in Wales, despite pushback from the farming industry and certain political opposition parties, is actually fundamentally right. that to get to grips with bovine TB, you must test cattle regularly, you must use the best techniques to find the reactors in the herd, which is a combination of the skin test, which has been used since the 1930s, that has problems, it's not 100% accurate. Gamma interferon testing, which can be applied alongside it, can make a huge difference. If you do that regularly, if you do it efficiently, you can find the TB reactors and you can remove them from the herd. And what we've seen in Wales over the last 12 months is a 14% drop in those new herd incidents, which is a sign it's working. The problem is that when you find the cattle, you end up slaughtering more of them. And the reaction of the farmers immediately is, well, it's getting worse, we've got to cull badgers. And the media, because they're quite lazy, don't explore that issue either. That becomes the headline. But the fact is, I think in Wales, they're getting on top of it. But it's a painful situation for farmers. But without that pain, you're not going to get the long-term gain. And if you look back, as I did for when I was writing the book, we found that actually in the 1970s, up to 79, the number of cattle in the national herd with bovine TB came down to nearly 0.5% or thereabouts, through a combination of good testing techniques, through removal of cattle through de-herd population, where they took the whole herd down, if the persistent outbreak couldn't be controlled. And bearing in mind, badgers only started being culled from 1975 onwards via gassing. So up to that point, farmers might have killed them, but in most cases they had no reason to do so. Because they might have damaged their land or crops, they might have killed a small number, but they couldn't blame them for TB. So this was not a result of culling badgers that you got that number down, it was through cattle-based measures. And I don't think there's any reason to believe things have fundamentally changed. One thing that has changed, as I said earlier, is the nature of the dairy and cattle industry in this country. It's become far more intensive for these businesses to survive. And when we went to the European Parliament recently, because we've set up this new Euro Badger group, where we're bringing NGOs from across Europe to protect badgers from Holland, Germany, France, which I think, despite the referendum issues at the moment, remains terribly important for cooperation. When I spoke in the European Parliament in Strasbourg about why we launched it, it was following a presentation on live animal exports, which was shocking to me, by Eurogroup for Animals, which Kerry you'll be familiar with, which was looking at the state of the cattle when they got to the Turkish border. And there was film that had been taken that was horrible, with cattle literally dying in trucks, no veterinary inspections taking place for 8-9 hours in the searing heat. And those cattle were being exported live, in my view, for no justification, but it goes on, despite all the European treaties and rules. The inspections are not being done as they should be, the animals are suffering terribly. And then I think, well, why is live animal export happening? Well, there are certain industries and vested interests that want to see it continue. There's over 1 million people in Europe that signed a petition against it. But at the same time, if you come back to Britain, one of the fundamental arguments within the NFU against cattle vaccination is because we might lose that market. We're not going to be able to move cattle out. That's madness. I don't want to see live exports if they can stop. If you don't have a live export problem into Europe, we could have sped up the vaccination trial and made it work far more quickly. So I said to those MEPs, this is all interconnected. You have a farming industry with a milk price that's dropping. You've got farmers that are having to move more cattle to supplement their income, which is disease control is becoming a problem. You're having farmers having to put more cattle into sheds for longer periods of time, breathing over each other, which is spreading TB. And then to make matters worse, you can't get a proper structure in place for a trial over the vaccine because you can lose exports of live cattle, which we know is terribly cruel and should end anyway. So I'm saying that actually, killing badgers is one end of a whole chain of misery that we should be fundamentally tearing apart anyway. We should bring to an end the live cattle business. We should vaccinate cattle against TB. We should continue to vaccinate badgers, and this BCG issue at the moment has to be resolved in government, where we have a shortage of vaccines, and I think we've got a lack of effort being made to find alternative sources and approval systems. We'll talk about that maybe in a moment, Mary. But that has to happen too. So vaccination of cattle, vaccination of badgers, tighter cattle control measures, including better testing systems, biosecurity controls and movement controls, and a fundamental change that is not forcing farmers to intensify and move more cattle. It's actually giving them better value for their product, which I would like personally to see more of it sold in the UK market. Because the final thing I'd say is that the cattle industry is also becoming increasingly export orientated. And when you speak to people like our current Environment Secretary, Liz Truss, she sees everything from an added value export perspective. She's an economist. But to be fair, when I worked in the food and drink industry for 8 years, that's all I did as well. was all about taking 2/3 of the raw materials that farmers produce in this country, putting it into the processed food industry, and then selling it in the UK or increasingly into what is a vibrant export market that employs, to be fair, in this country 500,000 people. So it's a big part of our economy. But that's not the only story, is it? Because if farmers are having to rely on selling into Russia, and they've lost that market because of EU sanctions over Ukraine, if they're having to rely on selling into China, which increasingly they are, these are all politically volatile, unstable markets. Long term, they're not really sustainable for them. But because they're having to rely upon them, we're killing our wildlife to a degree here in Britain. We're actually better that they produce higher quality food in a more environmentally sustainable way that we can buy, that the retailers can sell us on the basis that actually we're not killing wildlife for no reason. That might sound a bit optimistic, but having worked all the way through the food chain the way I have for the last 20 years, I do think it's a goal that's worth pursuing. So I think there are ways forward. I think we can change things. I'm very grateful for all what you're doing in government. I know it's difficult, not least at the moment, but I know you're a real believer in this because you've been out there when you were an opposition MP with us talking about this. You've been down in the fields. No one could say this is just an issue you're ticking a box on. You care passionately about it. I appreciate it. And we all do really appreciate that. But it's been hard for us, I think. So we sometimes criticise you and others, you know why. Because we feel frustrated. We feel that maybe people are not listening to us. And now we feel more uncertain than ever before. Because one of the arguments we've been opening up is actually that Europe could be a way forward for us helping to deal with this. Because of this €30 million of money we get every year. And the European Commission told us when I last met with them that actually, yeah, if we do get past this referendum and you stay in, we're very happy to engage with the British government how we can use that money more wisely. In the current climate, that discussion is going to be difficult. So that's it from me, but what I'd like to do is bring up Perry and sort of get a perspective from you, if you don't mind, and then we'll take a few questions as well. Thank you.